Welcome back to Two Creations, One Creator. I am your host, Isaac Bush. As you may be able to tell, play has been unwell, right? I have come down with my voice being lost. It's like the only symptom I have. So we just push through, right? And today I'm having on a good friend of mine, West Stadel. I'm very excited to have you on because you are a history major, correct?
History and political science.
Exactly. So, and we're talking about like political, what's it called?
Yeah, so like
Political church history.
political church history. So how the church has influenced politics in England and early America.
Right.
So
And so, without getting into it too much, would you care to go ahead and give us your testimony as brief or in depth as you would like?
yeah, so I'm gonna be doing the clear my throat the whole time too.
Dude, it's gonna be so brutal
So
right now.
but yeah, so I would say for me, I start young when I was younger. Like I was in a house where like Jesus was real, Jesus was important, but like don't go to church. Like we never went to church. We hardly ever prayed that I can remember. And I guess Christ was like this thing that existed and it was like over there basically. It wasn't really relevant. And I got to go to church with my grandma when I was younger. And I got exposure to the gospel and to Christ through that. And um, it wasn't really till about eighth grade where um, I was going through a lot and I felt like I needed to turn to Jesus and was able to profess my faith to him. And from that point on, it was very odd because um, I would say I had faith, but I didn't really know what to do with it. And so a lot of that was doing what the world was doing and doing like participating in the things of the world. And like really, it wasn't till freshman year here, and I took some Bible classes, right? And I had this kind of epiphany. I was like, I believe in the Bible, right? I believe it's true, and I say I'm a Christian, so I should probably figure out what's in this thing. So uh, I really locked in for that and read the Bible and learned about more about the gospel, more what we're commanded to do as believers, and building upon that, just getting slow, gradual exposure, I guess, to other believers, and having that epiphany again, where I was like, okay, you know, I know what the Bible says, and I believe it's true. And I'm seeing these other people around me who call themselves believers, but our lives are entirely different. So what's up with that?
Mm.
And then um, I would say I didn't really have explosive change until excuse me,
You're good.
junior year, like going into junior year, college. Um, I had a breakup that was pretty bad, and I really had to introspect and I had to ask myself, I was like, okay, uh, this sucks. Like this really sucks. And I can do two things from this point on. I can do what I've continued to do and was doing because I've been able to like fight some sin better and control some sin, I guess. I was like, I could go back down that route and just do whatever I want, do whatever makes me feel good. Or I could really put into practice like the things I'd been reading about and been learning about. And 'cause in my head, I was like, I have no excuse now to really live out what I say I believe. So I took that step and got involved at a church community back home. And then I came back here. It was like no question that I was going to get involved in the church and get in community. And so I met some pretty good guys through that. Um, I would say a person who really I guess gave me like my first taste of um, following Christ, serving Christ was Brennan Ziegler and Braylon Emerson. So
Mm,
both great guys, and through them, I was able to meet other guys like Noah Brandt, who's gone now, um, Wyatt Dickey, and Rowan Gilchrist. And like I'd say Noah and I are still really good friends, but I'd say like on campus right now, my two best friends are Wyatt and Rowan. And I started meeting with Wyatt once a week and doing discipleship. So it was like accountability, it was doctrine, it was knowing and learning what's in the Bible and actually living it out. That was such a blessing. And meeting those other guys, like Rowan in particular, he was a guy who we're very similar. We have similar hobbies, similar activities and stuff. And he was a guy that I could look up to and really like I say I say model, but it was model and like accountability essentially. Like put like encouragement, encouraging one another and pushing one of each other or another holy crap. Pushing each other to grow and learn more. And that was such a blessing too. And since then it's been really cool. Um, I've had opportunities to not just grow my own personal faith, but like share it with other people and pour into other people, teach other people, um, try to lead other people, and that's been really really cool. And I'm thankful that God's opened those doors in my life for me to do that. So, and I can say probably for the last year and a half that like Christ is the Lord of my life. So that's been such a blessing.
absolutely. Mm, absolutely, man. Pardon me. It's hard to like give a non-monotone reaction to things
Yeah.
right now, but oh yeah, it's a powerful testimony, and like yeah, I think it's super important to find those people that like iron sharpens iron,
Oh yeah.
where what's it called? You can just work out really well off one another and just what's it called be in community, work closer to God, by each other's company, whatnot. And I think a lot of people can relate to a testimony that's based on like, or not based on, but like the exponential growth after a breakup,
Oh yeah.
right? Or a loss of someone or something that is important to you. Just like the absence of that really gives that opportunity for Christ to fill in,
Hmm.
right? And it's not a matter of him just filling it; it's him becoming the center of your life, becoming like your entirety.
Yeah.
And
Being the keystone,
yes,
the
yes,
telos, the thing that holds everything together.
yes, exactly. So how would you how did you come down to find Cumberlands? Like what brought you here?
So I think that was a God thing, to be honest. So I had a friend that from back home that went here, and it was really interesting because we both came like went to school here, kind of at the same, I guess, level spiritually and in our lives. And I don't know, I I kind of like kind of grabbed hold of more spiritual things, I guess. And so like I kind of got a taste of like the Bible and the taste of the gospel and was seeking after that more. And he kind of went the opposite way. And we ended up kind of falling out. And I haven't really talked to him very much, but that's a whole another story. But um, that was interesting to see that difference because I think we both took opposite paths where I tried, I looked at, I guess, God's will and God's plan. And I may have not been walking very fast, but I was kind of tiptoeing towards it,
Right,
right? And I think he did kind of the opposite. So, and seeing that was kind of a wake up call too. Just like, do I want to live out the logical conclusion of that lifestyle, or do I want to live out the logical conclusion of a godly life? And I think I'm working towards that godly life. So,
right. or at least as best as we
Best
possibly
as
can.
best as I can, I'd say.
Right, absolutely. Well, that makes sense. That sucks that you had a falling out with him.
Yeah,
But I mean, the Lord will. If the Lord put you here, on this campus for whatever purpose and reason that he has planned for you, then that's awesome. And like,
yeah,
it's already very clear, like even through your testimony and through you knowing like guys like Wyatt and Rowan, that what's it called? Like he is growing you here,
oh yeah,
right? And he's being intentional and like your relationship. Would you say your relationship with God has grown since you've been here?
oh yeah,
Then
absolutely,
you're right.
absolutely.
So I think there's a pretty clear good signs that this is where he wants you. And I mean, yeah, I think that's awesome. But yeah, I guess getting more into the meat and potatoes, as I have been saying over the past
Hmm.
like 8 podcasts now, um, of what we're talking about today. I'm gonna let you speak mostly about these topics because you are the history major, and I am a like I'm aware of a lot of the subject matter that we're discussing, and I've been
Hmm.
intentional to do some research on it.
I appreciate that.
But when it comes down to it, I don't know that much about a lot of these things. So I'm very curious to know what you have to say. And so, like, well, I mean, for the listeners right now, what we're going to be mainly discussing is like a timeline almost
Hmm.
of how we got here. Or you said we're going to end at like the 1930s or whatnot,
I would end with probably like progressivism and social gospel,
right?
and I would say like the beginning of the charismatic movements, because I think they're inherently intertwined with progressivism.
Oh yeah, for sure, absolutely. But that's kind of like where we're going to be ending. I think it's just very important to learn about like
Hmm.
how we got here historically, right? Like church history can be accumulated into a lot of different things. Like,
Yeah.
oh, this is what the church was like in Ephesus, in the church in Macedonia, in the church in whatever location. This
Hmm.
is what it was like back then, and learning about that history and theology. But it's also very important, and I think low-key fitting with an election coming up,
Yeah.
right? Hopefully, we aren't gonna get into spewing our political beliefs.
No.
But okay, good, because I wasn't going to. But what's it called? More so to talk about like the political history of the church of how we got here on a like your textbook history level.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, go ahead and take it away. What do you got for us?
So I think to view the American church, you'd have to start in England, because the denominations that you mostly see in America, other than mostly the Baptists, I would say, those are all descendant from England, UK, Great Britain. So like Presbyterians, Methodists, Anglicans, Episcopalians. Those are your mainline denominations, and those are, besides Lutheranism and your niche like Reformed churches. Those are mostly the churches you see in the United States. Those are the ones that have had the most theological impact, I would say, up until probably the progressives. Um, so the English Reformation, that was very interesting. So England was a Catholic country, and England, Scotland, Ireland were all Catholic. And what had happened in Europe was the Lutheran. I'll start with Luther. So Luther happens in Germany, right?
Right.
His hundred theses, and gets excommunicated from the church. And what's really interesting about England is uh, England England's king Henry VIII um, publishes a knock on Luther, and Henry VIII is crowned by the Pope at the time as the defender of the faith. So Henry, it's actually I've not read it directly, but from what I've seen and heard, it's a very solid critique of Luther, according to Catholic theology.
So is it whenever like they're referred to as the defender of the faith, is that something that they like have to be the king would be proactive like to do and like actively what's it called overseeing theology and whatnot and doctrine?
Yeah, so the king, um, I believe it was there's contention about how much his advisor Thomas More had to do with the Henry's writings against Luther, but the king was actively defending, like doing apologetics and like not establishing theology, but I would say upholding theology.
Mm.
He's not making new anything. He's just kind of defining it and not refining it. Refining very in a very conservative sense.
Okay.
But um, so everybody knows about the English Reformation, why it happened. So essentially, what happened was King Henry was a part of the Tudor dynasty, and what had happened for the century before his father's rule, so Henry VII's rule. Henry VII was the like the end of the War of the Roses period is what it's called, and it was two royal families essentially fighting inwardly to control the monarchy of England. And Henry VII was a great one of England's best kings by far. And Henry, excuse me. Oh, crap. So
You're good.
Henry VII was one of England's best kings, and based upon that Civil War, War of the Roses, right? Henry VIII was obsessed with stability, succession, and keeping the legacy of his father alive. So Henry had big shoes to fill, and he had a lot of responsibilities. His first problem was he married Catherine of Aragon, who was the sister of the Spanish king, the Holy Roman Emperor, who controlled about I won't say half of Europe, but pretty close to half of Europe and Latin America, South America, except for Brazil. So this was that was a massive that was the superpower of the world was the Spanish Empire at that time, and Henry was married to the king's sister, and Henry had a problem where he couldn't have male heirs. So they had Mary the First with Catherine of Aragon and Henry, but he needed a male heir and couldn't get one. So that was a really big problem because they just got done fighting century long civil war about succession. And so that freaked Henry out pretty bad. He was already a paranoid dude to begin with, like the history records that pretty well. And so he decided he wanted to get a annulment. So it's not a divorce, and an annulment is divorce is sinful, right?
Right.
And so there's a doctrine in the Catholic Church called annulment. So what it is basically you get married and your marriage is declared invalid. So you weren't really married. So it's a whole technical thing, and there's a few like cut and dry like reasons for annulment, but we won't get into that because we got bigger stuff to talk about.
Right.
And the only problem with the annulment was that the king of Spain had troops outside of Rome and inside of Rome, and so they drafted that little letter of annulment, and that didn't go very well because the Pope read it and he's like, "Yeah, I'm not about to piss off the king of the of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire while his troops are in my city." So they said no, and Henry didn't like that, and so Henry started the process of leaving for the Catholic Church. And so the big thing about the that process, and there's a book and shout out to the history department at Cumberlands because this is the only reason I know this stuff. And there's a book from Christopher Haig called The English Reformations. He argues that the English Reformation happened in stages, basically, that there were multiple reformations that built upon each other. And so Henry Henry sought to he didn't essentially seek to leave the Catholic Church per se at the beginning, but relations soured and soured and soured to the point where he had to leave, basically. And so, what was very interesting at this time was the way England worked was it's very different to how we view government and the structure of government in America. Excuse me. They had a they had a view of the government of England called like there's a name for it, but I can't recall the name exactly. But what it is that the government is a body. So in England, there's the king, who's the head. There is the there's the torso, like the heart and the lungs, which is your parliament, which is you have an elected parliament, which is the House of Commons, and then you have the landed aristocracy. It's not it's sort of like our Senate, but not really. So if let's say your great grandfather is a earl of this area in England, his first son becomes the earl, and he gets a seat in the House of Commons or House of Lords. My apologies. And that and it's all hereditary succession. So and then the people are the hands and feet, and the king and nobody questioned that why is the king the king? Why are the lords the lords? Why are the why are the MPs the MPs? And why are the clergy the clergy? Everybody kind of just fell into the great chain of being is what it's called.
Mm,
So everybody fell into this chain, right? And you have a job to your higher ups, they have a job to you. If you're in the middle, you have a job to the people lower than you. You have a job to people higher than you. And there was this idea too in the king called prerogative. What it is basically whatever I say goes. If the king wants if the king wants this to happen, then that happens. And so what happens with the English Reformation is the church is so strong in England, right? There's literally magisterial courts. So if you commit there's like criminal law, excuse me, and then there's canon law. So if you're committing like acts of indecency that are sinful, you go to a magisterial court or you go to a canon court. So you get tried by bishops instead of judges. And so it's a really it's a really interesting thing.
that is very interesting.
We have no concept of that in America at all. And it's the church had tremendous power. So even in the House of Lords, part of it was staffed by clergy. So the bishops and the archbishops had seats in essentially the Senate of England. Because the church had so much power in England, um, Henry had to defer, I guess, not defer power, but empower the House of Commons to help him overcome the church. And he kind of like, he doesn't know it, but he basically sows the seeds of the destruction of royal prerogative. So even at this time, he's giving, um, it's like in the Commons, they're passing bills about eroding church power, and the king's directing it, but the Commons has power, and he's giving them power essentially, and that power only grows in the future. So what Henry does is um, he's appointed head of the church by the Commons, and he's given all church property becomes royal property. So in the church isn't like we think of it today. They don't have just church buildings or monasteries. Like the churches operated ports, they operated markets, they operated shops, all sorts of things. So these were now royal property, and King Henry overnight became the largest property holder in all of England when they passed that. So And English Reformation happens, and so there's a problem, and it's like, okay, so are we just Catholicism with Henry as the head, or are we something different? And uh, a guy named Thomas Cranmer came along. Thomas More was the advisor to Henry, and Thomas More was a faithful Catholic till the day he died, and refused to concede to Henry, and he was killed for it, martyred for it, and so he's sanctified in the Catholic Church. He's known as Saint Thomas More now
Mm.
because he was willing to die for the Catholic faith. And new guy comes along named Thomas Cranmer, and basically helps Henry seal the deal of the Reformation, and helps write what's called the 39 Articles of the Anglican faith. So what the 39 Articles are is he took from the Reformed tradition, more specifically like Calvin and Zwingli, and made England a or made Anglicanism a new denomination. And so it was very interesting. Like even Henry was about as Catholic as you can be as a Protestant. So Henry Henry held to almost every single Catholic principle, and the biggest conflict was the Eucharist. So they struggled about what is the Eucharist, and so their first option was no, it's really the body and blood, and then they kind of they were like it can be the body or the blood, or it can be spiritual, and so that was really funny.
Oh yeah, especially because there's like so many denominations now, and people will swear by is means is,
Yeah,
and that's such a
absolutely.
huge debate in what's it called, the American church and whatnot.
Yeah, and so Anglicanism is essentially a compromise between um, the Reformed view and the Catholic view of the church and theology. So they have a high church, but it's not as high as the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
They have a high view of the sacraments, but it's not as high as the Catholic Church. They pretty much believe I mean the 39 articles says that they affirm the creeds and the ecumenical councils only because they're scriptural. So they're giving both. They're getting both right there. So creeds, councils are true, but because they're aligned with scripture. So
Mhm.
um, I've had a chance to take a look at those with one of my friends, Hayden Spain. So
I love Hayden.
Hayden's awesome.
Hayden is awesome.
And so the church in England had a bit of a rocky history for a little bit. So Henry dies, and his daughter Mary the First takes over, and Mary the First is schooled in Spain, I believe, by Jesuits, if I'm not mistaken, and comes back to England and says, "Yeah, like y'all were playing y'all's Anglicanism was really fun. Now we're gonna be Catholic now." That really didn't work, and so um, they martyred a lot of Anglicans, and they tried to reinstate the Catholic Church, and then she didn't last very long for whole other reasons, and that was Parliament had their hand in that. So the theme you see growing and growing in as the Church of England grows is Parliament growing, which is really interesting. I
That
don't
is
I don't
interesting.
I don't think those two are inseparable, I guess. And so
So you think Parliament has always had like a distinct link with what the overarching belief in England was?
so Parliament till about the I would say the 1840s and 50s, before England really industrializes. The term that they would use in England is the yeoman farmer. So it's the gentleman farmer. And they're people who they're not massive. like plantations, but some of them are, but they're upper middle class, like lower nobility, basically, and they work and have they have, I would say, serfs, servants, farmers that work for them, but they're not like the plantation class of the South, where they're utterly removed from what they do. They're they're probably out there in the field working with them, overseeing the harvest, um, selling their goods, doing business deals, and so um, they're culturally, politically would be considered conservative, and so and for most of history they are Anglican. So they take up Anglicanism very early in the Reformation, and they hold to it for a very long time. And you'll see that when I talk about the English Civil War too. So Elizabeth comes along. She's Henry's second daughter. Henry is a son that rules for a little bit, but he's not really important because he's very sickly and dies while he's on the throne. But Elizabeth comes back and reinstates Anglicanism. And basically, by this point, it's pretty set in stone what it is. And um, like I said, like their high view of the sacraments, but not as high as the Catholic Church. Their high church, not as high as the Catholic Church. They're they're pretty much sola scriptura, pretty much sola fide, and that continues on for a little bit. But the big thing is icons that happens, and you see this a little bit during Henry's rule. So there's a lot of reformers who are iconoclast, and so what that means is they hate idols, like not icons, because they believe icons are idols. So you see a big movement in England where they literally whitewash. Is what like the term whitewash you think of now? That's where that comes from. They would go into these churches and literally take white paint and paint over everything because they didn't want to make idols out of icons. And so Elizabeth comes along, reinstates Anglicanism for the most part. And the problem she has is that she's the first female, I would say, like first legitimate female ruler of England. That's a pretty big deal.
Oh yeah.
And so she has to compromise. And so what she does is she takes what a group that started during Henry's reign called the Privy Council and makes them her advisors. And it's the point where you could very easily consider them like her best friends almost. And they're willing to talk about they're willing to because the problem with like authoritarian totalitarian leaders is have a guy like Henry who's I framed him where he's more moderate, but he's absolutely a totalitarian. Like if you oppose Henry, you will get executed.
So just
Like
Thomas
Thomas More.
More.
Thomas More.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that's also how like most of Parliament got to be so Anglican, is because what's it
Oh
called?
right. Oh yeah. They were
The
conforming.
right.
Yeah, they were conforming hard.
And if they didn't conform, they were killed for it, type of thing.
Um, you could be secretly Catholic, but
Right.
you had to you had to
Verbalize
you had
the Anglican
you
beliefs
did, yeah.
in
That's
articles.
how it worked in England
Right.
at the time. And I appreciate you saying that because it's kind of hard for people to grasp, especially in the modern world where we think it's you can worship at all times in history, like freedom of religion is just there.
Right. No, I mean
But
that's the Mayflower. What's it
yeah,
called?
Mayflower Compact.
Might be getting a little ahead of myself here, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So she promotes her privy council. So she has like basically a secretary of state. She has a director of spies, and these people are almost like what the classical writers would call a natural aristocracy. And so they're the highly competent people from um, the general public, and they're given power to help govern. And it's to the point where a writer in England calls the Elizabethan era a monarchical republic. So I thought that was very interesting. And Elizabeth is commonly cited as like the golden age of England. There was great literary works like John Milton. Um, Shakespeare is at the tail end of Elizabeth, more in the James King James the First. But this is an explosion of art, um, music, um, literature, etc., etc., and everything seems to be going well at that time. And like I said, the role of Parliament is growing and growing, and it's very interesting at this time. Speaking of John Milton, is there's a faction of people inside of England, and they're called the Puritans. You'll
Mm,
hear a lot about these people. They're very, very, very important. And so the Puritans are iconoclasts. They are they're not exactly they can be Presbyterian, they can be Episcopal, they can be Congregationalist, but um, they they believe in predestination. They're based on John Calvin, so
right,
they believe in predestination. They believe in they believe you have predestination but free will, and they believe that they're like the namesake. They're obsessed with purity. So these are the people in North America where they would not put blinds on their house because they didn't want to hide what they were doing inside their house from other people around them because they wanted to be so pure that they'd be literally like a light shining.
right.
And Puritans, the Puritans weren't. We have a distinction, and I think in America, in American theology, where we view ourselves as being like absolutely removed from the Catholic Church. But the way that these people thought was we're here to purify the doctrine of God, we're here to purify the practices of the church, and we're here to purify the church itself. So that means no icons, that means uh, total conformity to God's law, that means every part of your life is directed towards God. And they're obsessed with election and like you're either elect or you're reprobate. And your job on earth is to essentially prove that you're elect. And so, and it's something you grapple with essentially. So everything you do points towards your election, and um, and if you're not living out that life, then you're probably reprobate. Is what they believe.
These people were, what do you call it? Like Puritans arose, obviously not just in America,
Hmm.
but like at the tail end of the English Reformation or after the English Reformation,
So they were there,
like the entire time.
sort of. They
Okay.
didn't really. So like John Milton is the first person I think of who's a Puritan in England. So they're they're not involved directly in like Henry, for example,
Mhm.
but they're slowly creeping in. And by the time of James, and especially by the time of Charles the First, they're there. Like they're trying to call the shots. And they're very interesting. So they live in the north in the southeast of England. So they're the so you think about Parliament, right? This is a big thing with English Civil War. Parliament is the landed aristocracy. They're like central England, basically. And then the Puritans are northeast. Then the Puritans are the merchant class. They're doing all the trading with Netherlands and France sometimes whenever they're not fighting France. And They're very different. They're very industrious. The idea of the Protestant work ethic we have in the United States, it's really the Puritan work ethic. So these people work. That's part of their work. So part of your um, I guess salvation and sanctification. Part of knowing if you're elect as a Puritan is if you have a vocation. That's where we get. That's what that word. A vocation is a calling. So if you don't have a vocation in the Puritan eyes, you're probably not saved. You're probably not elect. And so part of their work is I'm proving my salvation through my work. And that's why they're so obsessed with work and with industriousness and studiousness. And it's very, very interesting. And that's where we get our Protestant work ethic from. And they have they have some similarity to, I'd say, like American Baptists in a certain way, but it's not those things mostly. It's usually they do believe that they don't believe in. If I'm not mistaken, I think they believe in that you all you need to do is profess faith to be saved. They believe um, they were the first people to do what I would call basically like very simplified, not dumbed down, but dumbed down sermons. So a church you go to today where they're preaching very straightforward, very like here's the gospel, here's Christ crucified, and that's what first like Paul tells us in First Corinthians to preach. Like that's they're straight up just down to earth preaching. They're the first group to do that, and but anyways, they're there and they're obsessed with purity. And if you're not pure, you're dirty and you're impure and you have to be purified. And whether you like it or not, that's the Puritan mindset. And that that's a pretty significant one. Like there's not a lot of room for toleration if you're either pure or impure. It's one or the other. It's us versus them. It's dirty, nasty versus clean. And so they have a problem with the Church of England because it's too Catholic. And so they're going to pick away and try to erode the the Catholic nature of the Anglican Church, the Catholic nature of the Anglican Church.
Mm,
And so I'll go ahead and fast forward. Like James the First, really interesting. King James Bible. That's who that comes from.
right.
And he's Scottish. And so what happens is Scottish and the French are very intertwined. So James has a very, very different view of England in the ancient constitution than Henry does. Henry, Elizabeth, Mary do. And runs into some problems because for 70 years, 70-ish years, Parliament's gained power. They've gained control. And you get people, by the time of Charles the First, there's this idea of sovereignty that gets talked about. So before Henry, it was and even during Henry, it was utterly known that the the king is sovereign. The king has prerogative. Prerogative is sovereignty. Prerogative is I say what I want and it goes.
Mm,
And sovereignty, as a definition, is final and unappealable authority. There's nothing you can do to appeal what if somebody's sovereign, what they say goes, and there's nothing you can do about it, legally speaking. You can resist with violence, but that's not really legal.
right.
And and um, and that spirit of debate comes about actually from John Knox in Scotland to kind of bounce around. But Scotland has its own Reformation, and Scotland's Catholic, and they are really influenced by John Calvin, and especially by a guy named John Knox, who's a um, for all intents and purposes, is kind of the founder of Presbyterianism. And so he studies under John Calvin in Geneva and goes into Scotland and through military conquest essentially turns Scotland into a Presbyterian country. And then yeah, James has this view of the ancient constitution that doesn't really line up with what everybody else in England thinks. And he's definitely an outsider. He's treated like an outsider and is ostracized. And um, he's not really able to do a lot. Like he has these very authoritative, um, like royal sovereignty views, but he just can't do anything with it because everybody's like, "This is a Scot. Nobody likes him." And then he dies, and Charles the First comes to power. And by this point, there was a lot of stuff floating around. So there was this idea of parliamentary sovereignty proposed by a guy named Edward Cook, who's probably one of the greatest lawyers of all time. He's probably top three in my opinion. Um, he really like defines what the common law is. That's a whole other thing. I'm not going to get into the law because frankly, most people would not want to hear that. So and it's not relevant to the church.
Right.
But Charles II comes along and he says, like screw all this parliamentary sovereignty stuff. Um, I'm going to do whatever I want, and I'm going to violate the ancient constitution. It starts with money, so he wants to levy a tax, and in the ancient constitution, all bills of spending and taxation start in the House of Commons. House of Commons is not putting up with it because it's all political stuff too. It's the same thing, and it's not kind of the same thing, but it's kind of the same thing. It's like quid pro quo essentially. It's like the king does this, and then we'll pass a spending bill. King says, "I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to pass my own spending bill through my prerogative." And there's a famous cases called the ship's money cases where he imprisons 5 knights for not paying the tax to the king, and that really, really, really makes Parliament mad. And so, um, what happens in the English Civil War is essentially a conflict about funding and budgets. So, because the king's still fighting with House of Commons for money, and it ends up what happens is there's a lot of Puritans in Parliament now, and so you have the merchant class versus the aristocracy. Merchants are the Puritans, the aristocracy are the Anglicans, and so they get to a point where there's nothing left to talk about, and they duke it out, and the Puritans win, which is a pretty big deal. And so the Puritans put their military leader named Oliver Cromwell in charge. They turn England into basically a Puritan theocracy, and they people really don't like it.
Yeah, how long did that last?
Um, I think Cromwell died not too long after the English Civil War. I think let me look it up real quick.
Because I feel like just like with especially with all the change in theology and all the change in like how society observes theology and things of that nature, a new theocracy being taken under such like, steep conditions
Yeah,
would definitely not be something that the public would enjoy.
yeah. So Cromwell died in 1658, and the excuse me, English Civil War happened in 1648. So so England has a very different culture than we do, I'd say. So one thing that is very common in England is pubs. So a pub back then wasn't it's not a place where people go and hook up and uh, get really drunk, for example. Back then, it was everybody, all the men and people get together at the pub. And they talk, hang out, and they drink like very diluted, what we like beer or ale, and it was more of a social gathering than it was party. And Cromwell closed all the pubs. He made parades illegal. He made dancing in public illegal. I believe he made playing music in public illegal, and he had total control over the Anglican Church and made it Puritan. And so he dies. People are really fed up with the Puritans. That's about the last time they have real influence in England. Up until their ideas stay for a decent amount. I guess their cultural ideas stay. They're still like the industriousness in England. They're still the mercantile class. That's what allows them to become the first country to industrialize and um, become a world superpower. But that's kind of like the cap of English history for I'd say for our purposes today.
Right.
So what really happens, what's very important for us is when James comes along, backtracking a little bit, James comes along, the Spanish are have basically dominance over the Americas at this point. There's I think I don't even think the French have colonies. The French are eventually go down the St. Lawrence River and they in Louisiana
Right.
and the Spanish are making unfeasible amount of money in the New World. And so England wants a little piece of that pie, and they have Roanoke that fails, and then they go to Virginia.
Mm.
And they set up a colony called Jamestown under the
Yeah.
rule of King James. And Jamestown is basically transplanting your aristocracy, your landed yeoman farmer into the Americas,
Mhm.
and they struggle pretty
Oh
hard.
yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say a corporate colony, but they're essentially a corporate colony. They're by far more religious than we could ever imagine in our current culture, but their sole purpose was to establish a colony, start churning a profit, and grow. And they struggle really hard for about 30 years, and they're fighting with natives. There's infighting. There's administrative problems and famine. And if you look at the legal codes of Jamestown, it's like you die for stealing a loaf of bread. Basically, you get hung for stealing bread. That's how bad it was in Jamestown. And then there's a colony in Massachusetts called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's the one that's you learn about the Pilgrims and the Mayflower and Plymouth. Like those are important, but the Massachusetts Bay Colony is by far the most important colony in other than Jamestown. And Massachusetts Bay is the Puritans, the merchant class Puritans from southeast England, and their goal is to set up a theocracy, and they literally want to be this like the city on the hill from the Sermon on the Mount,
Right.
and they they have all sorts of religious law, canon law. Um, you will get put in the stocks if you violate the laws of the Sabbath. So, like if you get an ox out of a ditch on the Sabbath, you will get put in the stocks. Basically, that's how strict they are, and they're two basically entirely different cultures, and they're so opposed to each other they fight a civil war. And the way I don't know, I would compare it sort of to, I would say, like the far left and the right in America. That's how, like, they don't really agree on anything at all in their spheres, and they live with each other. And phrase this. Let me cut this out. Yeah, they don't agree with each other on very much at all. It's almost like they have two different worldviews essentially, and there is conflict that happens because of that. In our case, doesn't have to be violence. Obviously, like there's debate and there's um, governmental proceedings and stuff. It doesn't have to be solved by violence, obviously, but and I think you can view the narrative of American history up up to the Civil War as essentially being a conflict between the culture of the Puritans and the culture of the landed aristocracy, with the infusion of the Scotch Irish. The Scotch Irish are really interesting. So they basically live on the borderlands of England. They're very rugged, individualistic, violent, prideful people. And these are the people you hear about, um, like literally 100 years ago, like fighting duels still. And there's accounts of these people literally doing what they do, like doing fights. And they would line up and they would ask each other, like, do you want a rough and tumble fight? And rough and tumble literally meant like gouging eyes, breaking fingers, breaking noses. And there's a historian that account that he records a fight that happens where both men are blinded from the fight. And they would rather be blinded than to lose their honor. That's how obsessed with honor these people are. And
It's
those are your like those are a lot of your Southerners too. So like the people who go out and settle Texas, like those are Scotch Irish. You think about the rugged, individualistic Texan, he's Scotch Irish.
right.
But and at the very founding of the country, so it's so interesting. Um, there's literally a factions of anti-federalists and federalists, and you can line those up based on where they're from. So your anti-federalists are like Virginia, set in the South. Your Federalists are Charleston, South Carolina, where because Charleston was an older colony. It was basically like a port before you get to Bahamas and the Caribbean islands of the English, and New York and Massachusetts. Those are your Federalists. So Hamilton was New York. John Adams was uh, John Adams was Massachusetts. Then a guy named Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, I believe is yeah, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was a Charleston Federalist. Then your anti-Federalists like Patrick Henry
Yeah,
and even Jefferson and Madison, who come later on, they're anti-Federalists. They're all from Virginia, and so the the debate in early America was, quite strangely enough, it was a sovereignty debate. So,
amongst the Federalists and the
mhm.
Anti-Federalists.
so this was during the Constitution. So, was the federal government sovereign, or did the states have sovereignty and essentially through the Constitution vest powers to the federal government? So, and did the state have the final say on what the federal government's powers were? That was the debate. And in the founding, so that's yes, the Civil War was about slavery. It absolutely was.
That was the main thing, the big thing.
Absolutely. But there is the conflict of state sovereignty and states and relationship to the federal government is a conflict that precedes that, and it's at the very nature of the founding.
So you're saying that because of the like Federalist, Anti-Federalist, like their conflict during the Constitution, that was a persistent conflict that lasted all the way up until the Civil War?
Yeah. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was, I guess, the roots of the problem, and I guess the tree that grew from that started the Civil War was slavery.
Right.
So,
So how did that obviously the Federalists, Anti-Federalists were talking about sovereignty of
mhm.
state versus government. How does that correlate with the church in
So
America at the time?
at the church, so what's really interesting about the church, this is kind of that's kind of the political background. So the way that the church in America, there's a book called The Democratization of American Christianity. It's one of the better books I've read for my history classes. And what happens essentially is the old order has these so the old order of the Massachusetts and Virginia has these structured, ossified churches. So in Massachusetts, you had the basically like um, it's called Congregationalist Puritans. That's who the Puritans were in North America. They were Congregationalist Puritans. And then in the South, you had the Anglican Church. And what happened was these churches were the thesis of the book is essentially that those churches were European and they didn't accommodate for the spirit of America. And so what you saw in church history was people like George Whitfield, John Wesley, um, Charles Finney, and these other people either came from England to the Americas or they came up in the Americas and they preached revival essentially. So Methodism was a part of was essentially like a excuse me
Of course.
huh, Methodism was an evangelical branch of the Anglican Church, but it ended up devolving in not devolving, but it ended up separating into its own denomination. And so um, John Wesley is one of the big architects of that. Methodism spread a lot in the South, and Presbyterianism the same way. So Presbyterian was the Scottish John Knox. They uh, they sent missionaries to the United States, established churches, and grew. And the Methodists actually, uh, I would say, the largest Black American denomination is a Methodist denomination. So I believe it's the AME is what it's called.
Mhm.
And there was and Baptists kind of show up at this time. Um, those are very individualistic denominations of Christianity. It's about personal relationship. It's about they're congregationalists. It's about personal relationship. It's about personal salvation and sanctification, and it's about evangelical. It's very evangelical by nature. And you saw explosions in piety, explosions in salvation, explosions in missions, and what you saw as a result of that is individuals within the society or within the United States had more personal, tangible faith, and they started doing things. So one example is they started doing prison reforms. This is about the 1840s, is when the 30s and 40s when it's called the Second Great Awakening. And Puritans also backtrack. Puritans had a great lot of great theologians and preachers. Like Jonathan Edwards is probably the most famous preacher in America, other than like Billy Graham, I would say.
Right.
There's also people like Cotton Mather, who were super impactful on the American theology. Um, Jonathan Edwards' "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" is probably one of the most read sermons in the entire world. I think it's a series of sermons actually, but um, yeah, 1830s and 40s, you see personal. religious growth in America showing itself in the culture. And you see things like temperance. So, temperance is the word temperance is moderation, essentially. It's one of the cardinal virtues in the classic thought. Um, it's moderation, right? So, you want to be temperate about your use on on your phone. You don't want to be on your phone for 12 hours a day. But if you're on your phone like 0 hours a day, it's probably not going to help you because you probably need to text people. Like you probably would have a really hard time scheduling people for your podcast if you weren't on your
Right.
phone. So there's a what Aristotle would call a virtuous mean. So somewhere virtue lies between two vices. So you think about courage. The courage is the virtue between cowardice and uh, rashfulness, and that's what temperance is, and that applies specifically to alcohol. And this was a big deal in America. Like, the amount of alcohol people drank in America is unfeasible. We're talking we're talking probably I would say 10 to 20 times what the average adult now drinks.
Right.
So after temperance, though, it got cut in half. So now the average adult was probably only drinking 10 times what they do now. And part of that is um, you would drink alcohol because you couldn't drink the water, and the alcohol that they drank. So your average, if you go out to a store and you buy like Miller or Bud Light, you're talking about like three. Holy
And this also precedes if you hit me.
If you go to um, a gas station and buy a Miller Lite now, you're probably sitting at about 3% alcohol by volume. But the alcohol back in 1830, 40 was probably 1% to, or lower than 1% too.
Mm.
So,
And that also, what's it called, precedes prohibition, which we see later on in the
yes. So,
1900s,
so
which is what's it called, heavily ushered in by there's a lot of like what's it called Christian. Um, I'm forgetting what denomination, but there's a specific denomination that was very heavy. Hey, let's usher in prohibition. It was very for prohibition.
oh, yeah. So I'll get to that. I'll kind of,
Right? Yeah,
I'll
jumping
kind
ahead
of
of
speed,
myself.
I'll kind of speed around the politics and talk more about the church. But I think the history of the Anglican Church is so fascinating.
Oh yeah,
But 30s and 40s, uh, there's a really big drinking problem, and part of it is industrialization, especially in the North. You like, and there's a lot of distilled spirits, so that's kind of a new thing. So with low percent alcohol, there is a lot of social norms around that at the time. So they fight to lower that alcohol usage per American. And they do succeed, and that's not a top down government thing. It's a you go to church and your pastor's like, hey, you should probably not get drunk all the time. And it's like, man, that's really true. Like I'm I've I've just got saved at a revival and like I really want to follow Jesus and I feel the conviction in my heart. I probably shouldn't, drink like entire fifth of whiskey every day.
right.
So and that was a thing. That was a thing. There was prison. That was probably the most important thing of that era. There was prison reform. That was really important. There was mental health reform. So that's the first time you see what we would call like sanatoriums. So there are clean because what happened before is if you were mentally ill, you just get thrown in prison. And so that part of that era with the religious revival was, hey, there's people who are really mentally ill. They shouldn't be in here with prisoners and being like forced to live with rats, basically, and murderers and thieves. We should actually give them accommodation that's ethical and good. So that was part of that era. And then, so slavery really split the church up, in the United States. It was very interesting. So I know in my hometown, there's a Methodist and a Presbyterian church. And the Presbyterian church, the Methodists split from the Presbyterians. Like this, or they didn't split essentially. There was a split in the Presbyterian church that's been there before the state was founded. The
Hmm.
Presbyterian church, beautiful church, and they were split over the issue of slavery. Because I'm from East Tennessee. East Tennessee almost joined the Union, and so half of the church left that Presbyterian church and went to a Methodist church in downtown. And our history teacher told us that, and you're like, yeah, these two churches split. Like this church exists because slavery and because people left that church. And slavery doesn't settle down at all in America. It boils and boils and boils. And there's a guy that comes along named Abraham Lincoln.
Ever heard of them?
If you've ever heard of him, um, so he's so important. What I think is so important about him is he's like the manifestation of Puritanism in politics. Abraham Lincoln is quoted as saying he wants a national religion. He wants to make divine the state and the institutions of government. Um, and he uses biblical rhetoric to talk about government and the state. It really creeps me out when I read it because I don't think you should
You're
make this
doing
make
that
the state divine. I think he's the ultimate, I guess, manifestation of Puritanism in American politics. Um, he he believes essentially that there's the highest end to with the telos we talked about earlier. Telos is in Greek is like the ultimate end. It's the highest thing. The telos of America is not what the founders believed. It's not what all his predecessors believed. It was this idea in the Declaration that all men are created equal in their. Oh. It's this idea in the Declaration that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator to certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's his ultimate view, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to achieve that view. So Lincoln is a radical at this time. Like the way that we view the world now is a Lincolnian view. It's not what the founders believed. It's very interesting,
that is very interesting.
and it's so hard for us to imagine outside of Lincoln's view of what government is. That's why when you go to school, you can ask history majors this. You can ask them. Uh, they'd probably know more about the Declaration of Independence than they do the Constitution, and the Constitution is the governing document of this country. Like if you ask a history major where the enumerated powers section is, I would say 7 out of 10 couldn't tell you where it is.
That is interesting.
So
So how did this Laconian view that got established because of you know Lincoln's what's it called power here in
yeah,
America? How did that what's it called impact the church? 'Cause I mean, if he's a secular
oh yeah,
Puritan,
absolutely. So Lincoln, my belief is that the logical conclusion of Puritanism is progressivism,
mm,
and so Lincoln is by far the beginning of progressivism in the United States. So progressivism is very interesting. It has a few presuppositions. So you cannot have progressivism without social Darwinism. And social Darwinism's a dirty term and for a lot of good reasons. What social Darwinism is that people, ideas, societies, countries are competing in a evolutionist Darwinian warfare where the most evolved, the best survives and the rest die. And so you have to have that to have progressivism. there's no separation of the two because progressivism by its nature is that you must progress. And there's a cool kind of fusion, I would say. There's this guy in Germany called Hegel. He has this idea of what progress is. So he's this the synthesis and antithesis, or thesis and antithesis. You have two opposing ideas. They come together at a head. They produce a synthesis. And it takes both of those ideas, takes the good parts of them, brings them together, and the rest of the stuff gets thrown out. And that's how you get progress, according to Hegel. And so that's essentially what progressivism is you're steamrolling conflict, you're incentivizing conflict, and you're not holding to tradition because sometimes tradition can be a chain, but sometimes tradition can be a guardrail.
Mm,
So they treat tradition. Well, the problem with um, intellectual conservatives is that oftentimes like chains are treated as guardrails sometimes.
mhm,
The problem with progressives is that all guardrails are chains.
right.
So
There needs to be a healthy balance
there
of the
needs to be a
two,
healthy balance. So they think they
and that
think
could be its own
yeah,
entire pod. I'm so sorry, I just cut you off and
they
didn't
go
mean to
ahead.
do that. That could be its own entire podcast about like the role of tradition in the church today,
Oh
where
no.
it stands and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off
Now
there.
you know you're absolutely good. And no, we've only got a few more minutes, about 10 minutes. I'll probably won't take very much longer. I'm a little over schedule, like I told you,
Hey, it's totally fine.
but um, progressivism is puts progress at the top. You have to progress because, but in its own basically logical conclusion, if you don't progress, you will die off. So, in that we should ignore tradition, we should ignore experience, we should ignore custom, and we should ignore prudence. Um, Edmund Burke, just pairing conservatism with progressivism. Edmund Burke, the great conservative philosopher, says that conservatism is a politics of prudence, which I think that's great, a great way to explain it. And prudence is thrown out the window in exchange for momentary gain. So the progressives dominate every aspect of America, and Lincoln gives them the foundation, and the progressives kind of just take it and run with it.
Right.
And so the great Americans of the 1880s all the way to probably the 30s, we're talking like FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, all these people you know from history class, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, um, the great Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, um, all these people, everybody you can think of from that era. Rudyard Kipling, the great poet, is a progressive, and those they believe that Western culture. Holy crap! They believe that Western culture, Western Christianity, has to evolve and it has to keep growing, or else it'll die. If you're not growing, you're somebody else is growing, and they're gonna swallow you and consume you. So that's when you really see these radical movements in the church. Like excuse me, prohibition is probably the most radical movement in the church.
Right.
So prohibition is completely different from temperance, and prohibition was actually spearheaded by women. So there's a story in the Midwest. The Midwest were the progressive states. So um, there were women who there was a saloon, and the women went in there, and these were women who could vote inside the state elections. They were viewed as n- more equal than of their women counterparts in like the East, essentially. And they protested the saloon, and they finally uh, took horses and wrapped ropes around the saloon and ripped the saloon off its foundations and drug it down the street and destroyed it. And they would there was women that would literally they would go into bars and saloons during working hours. And they'd take axes and hammers, and they'd bust all the bottles, um, destroy the barrels, and bust these saloons up. And they had to go out of business. And um, the prohibition was based central to progressivism because there's no scriptural evidence for prohibition. Um, the Bible the Bible says very clearly that alcohol is permitted,
Mhm.
that Jesus drank wine. And what was so radical about prohibition compared to temperance was it was a top down thing. So the there's a name for the group. There was a literal group who was dedicated to the prohibition of alcohol in the United States, and they lobbied Congress, they lobbied the state representatives, and they lobbied the um, state houses and senates to um, make the sale of alcohol, sale, transport, and alcohol illegal in the states. And then they passed a constitutional amendment that banned alcohol for the not the use of alcohol, but it was the sale and the transportation of alcohol.
Right.
And so the experts in the church lobbied Congress. They said, "We know better for you than not to drink." And there was popular support for it,
Right.
but I think people really just got whipped up into hysteria around it because it got really, really unpopular really
Mhm.
quickly. And I think it's very interesting too the tradition of the church. Um, Thomas Aquinas says that he says that we should not seek to ban lesser vices lest we fall into greater vice, and we did exactly that with prohibition, and we saw the rise and the birth of organized crime in the United States,
Right.
and we saw um, bootlegging and people actively breaking the law. And when those bootleggers got done bootlegging, they didn't stop committing crime.
Right.
They ran rackets, they ran scams, and then they got into drugs. They got into all sorts of horrible things like human trafficking, and that was the birth of organized crime in the United States. And it was because we thought through our reason at that time in that moment that we could solve a problem and that the unintended consequences didn't matter.
Mhm.
And so uh, the other thing is, I would say the social gospel was really big for progressives. So what they did was they said we're tired of waiting for heaven for things to get better. We're gonna make we're gonna make earth better.
Right.
That's social gospel is the driving force behind prohibition, for example.
And social gospel is inherently connected with progressivism.
Absolutely. And you saw Christian socialists. So if the communist revolution happened in America, never happened in Russia, America very easily could have become a Christian socialist country. It's very interesting. And we saw Christian socialism, and then we saw the rise of evangelicalism and charismatic Christianity. So what they're linked, sort of. I'm not going to say that evangelicals and charismatics are the same because I might get crucified. But what their underlying presuppositions are is that the church has to progress, the institutions of the church are holding us back. We're being held back by maybe our reliance on um, intricate theology. We're being held back by our um, over reliance on the institution of the church itself. And so our job is we're just we're just going to preach to individuals. And it sounds great.
Right.
It sounds great. And then you really get into the
Practice of it.
you get into the weeds of it. And it's like, okay, what do we believe? Yeah, I think it's very important to look at the ideas that underpin what we believe and the institutions we're a part of, like like evangelical Baptist, like evangelical non-denominational churches are underpinned by that progressive ideology. They may not be biblically progressive, but they're progressive in the way compared to the church. And like I said, your tradition can be a guide rail or a chain, and sometimes those chains are really nice to cut off, and sometimes you miss those guardrails. So,
For sure.
absolutely.
All right. Well, it was lovely having you on, Wes.
Absolutely. Thanks for
You
having me on.
are super knowledgeable about history, and at least in comparison to me. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking about it some. But as for you listeners, this will be back on Two Creations, One Creator official on YouTube. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week. I have some big, pretty big plans. See y'all.